Did you know that for about 300 years it was technically impossible to murder an Englishman in England? The word murderum is where we get the modern word murder. And of course, Englishmen were killed in those periods, but technically speaking, the use of the word murder, murderum, was not actually valid if you were English. King Canute introduced the murderum fine. It was a fine for a secret killing. This is a long time ago. King Canute is obviously famous for the story about controls on royal power. He said waves go back, the waves ignored him and the tide came in. Probably didn't happen, but he did introduce the murderum fine, the murderum law. Now the problem was a lot of the settlers from Denmark had come over here, the Danish area, had started to settle and they were turning up dead in surprisingly large numbers. The locals were killing them secretly. So in an attempt to limit this and to raise taxes as well, he introduced a murderum fine. If you did produce a killer, maybe you actually didn't know who the killer was, but you found somebody that locals didn't like and handed them in and they were done, then that fine was not levied on the local area. And if the immediate local area didn't have enough money, well, it went to the wider local area as well. So a whole bunch of people in a broader area would be charged the 46 marks. If you managed to track the killer down and produce them within a year, you got your money back. So, you could send people out to try and find somebody who could be turned in as the killer. This whole thing sort of disappeared a little bit in the English law for quite a long time, until the Norman conquest. 1066, the Battle of Hastings, it wasn't all over for Duke, now King William, because for pretty much the rest of his life, he was fighting rebellions, great and small. Hereward the Wake in the marshes, the northern barons were rising in revolt. So much was happening that he was constantly going backwards and forwards, fighting to try to maintain Norman control. And lots of Normans were turning up dead in strange circumstances. They were being tracked down by the local resistance, by just local people, and being killed, and their bodies just being left. The Normans reintroduced the murderum fine. Again, it was a good money earner, and if a dead body turned up, it was presumed to be Norman, and the local area would be fined. If you could prove that the dead body was an Englishman, you didn't have to pay the murderum fine, and this was called presentment of Englishry. So effectively, if that dead body was Norman, then it was murder and the fine would be levied. And that was the presumption. If it wasn't, and if you could prove it was an ordinary English person, well, I'm afraid the murderum fine was not due and you could get away with it. We have from the court rolls several circumstances where false presentments of Englishry are investigated. People were pretending that this Norman was English to get away with the fine. And you also had huge arguments about whether this person genuinely was proven to be English or were they Norman. The Murderum Act was abolished by Edward III in 1340 under the Englishry Act. Effectively, it had become impossible for quite a long time to tell who was Norman and who wasn't, and there's a couple of interesting quotes from the time. Those who were left of the Anglo-Saxon subjects secretly laid ambushes for the suspected and hated race of the Normans, and here and there, when opportunity offered, killed them secretly in the woods and in remote places as vengeance. Isn't it fascinating that for 200 or 500 or 600 years there was a law which meant it was much worse to kill somebody who wasn't English in England than somebody who was an invader? It just shows you sometimes that the victors make the rules and the locals suffer. There are two fascinating little nuggets of information that I've discovered while doing the research for this. One is that the Templars were exempted by Richard the Lionheart from the murderum fine. Don't know why, there's no more information on it than that. He said, you're exempted from murder. A little bit later than Richard, Henry I also exempted the whole of the city of London from the murderum fine. Now that begs the question whether there were so many murders going on in London that it just was impossible to keep up with it and people couldn't afford the fine, or more likely it was a package of measures designed to kind of bring favour to the king from the city of London. We just don't know. We don't know the circumstances surrounding it.